Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets continue their offseason agenda, offering the qualifying figure to one Trendon Watford. Will he ultimately return as we take a look at the landscape of the NBA, players that may become available, and how the Brooklyn Nets should be watching high-level trades so they can go ahead and nibble around the fray? We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast, right here on Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Marbick. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen today. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And tell you, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, all summer long, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. And Doug, we got news and notes, man. There's a lot of things to break down here. Starting first and foremost, talk about Cam Johnson, I think, and interesting angles around the NBA and his potential market. But Trendon Watford, a player that you and I both liked when the Nets took a flyer on him at the beginning of this last offseason, at least getting the qualifying offer, does not officially make his return to Brooklyn just yet.
Yeah, reported by Brian Lewis, who's been really, really dialed in on that stuff really for a long time. And this offseason specifically, they're going to extend the qualifying offer to Watford, just a programming note. We are recording this on Saturday afternoon. So
right.
in sort of in preparation for the week ahead. But the all intentions seem to be that they're going to extend him a qualifying offer. Obviously, a qualifying offer does not mean that he is back on the team. It just means he's made a restricted free agent, can still shop the market, see if there's any other potential signings out there. There might be, by the way, too. I mean, some of these teams are in sort of we're seeing this really unfold here in the landscape of everyone kind of getting schooled up on the new CBA pretty quickly here and how it can be really, really just prohibitive to just really spend extra money. So guys who actually have NBA skills who might come a little on the cheaper side for maybe multiple years could have a little more value in this year than other years and going forward. But so I'm not sure if there's going to be a market for Watford. I suspect someone probably sees something in him just because, the size, the versatility, he's still not that old at 23, showed enough last year. So we'll see how it goes. My guess is back in a Brooklyn Nets uniform, but just mostly putting the asterisk here is saying qualifying offer does not mean see you for 100% in a Nets uniform next season. Like there still could be a market for him, which the Nets would be able to match if they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think too, when it comes to Watford, maybe as you just mentioned there about matching it. Okay, there's a world where certainly other teams may have a market for him, but it's not like you're thinking or being worried about if you're Brooklyn. Some team comes flying in here with an offer that's so sizable, you say, "Oh, we can't match that," right? It's probably going to be something within a reasonable range where even if it's a 2 or 3 year offer from another team, it's not going to be prohibitive for the Brooklyn Nets to bring him back and match that offer. You can make the case it actually be valuable to them because over the next 2 or 3 seasons, whether there's another trade to be made down the line, he's of the right age and seems to be on the uptick here where you'd say, okay, good to have him on the roster. And you could also make the argument case that if you're looking at developing players, as we said, he showed some good things this past season with Brooklyn. But I like the idea now that you're clearing away, we think, as we'll talk about Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith here a bit more, clearing away all the veterans. Well, yeah, I'd like a sample size where you give him some more extended run at point forward minutes, where you see how he fits with Clowney and Claxton and Thomas, right? You'll now know on a stronger level as you work your way towards the 2025 draft, which young players are going to be deserving of being a part of that core beyond this season.
Yeah, and the Nets are in a position now where like they need to make sort of like long-term decisions about everybody or anybody. I will say with guys on the roster that are still on the younger side of things, it makes sense to and they've shown anything on an NBA level, which I think Watford has, that it makes sense to sort of keep these guys around over the next couple of years, especially a guy with versatility that can just do a bunch of different things. So you're not boxed in, around 1 or 2 ideas, even when the tank is going to be on. Now, with him, it's like, what does he do? Any one particular thing awesomely? No, but he showed himself to be like, fairly versatile. Like I said, 6'8", 230, not a ton of volume, but 39% from 3 over the course of the last 12 games, which is when he actually started playing real minutes. The assist rate was, decent. They did have him playing point guard at times. He rebounded the heck out of the ball. Like there were like real signs, I think, of something. And we already know that the Nets, at least right now, based on the current roster, I mean, it really don't have any ball handling at all. And even for a team in the tank, at some point you had to have somebody here that can dribble the ball.
Right.
And so there's, besides Schroeder, besides Cam, really, I'm sure they're going to bring in some very cheap point guard here, you would think. But they just really don't have much in the way of on-ball stuff at all, even if Watford's like not the traditional archetype around that. So I just think there's enough reasons here to do it. And you'd have to think, can't be 100% sure about this, but you'd have to think like almost no matter how things shake out for the Nets, especially where he is, and you should always just take the most money, that the opportunity here will be the most just because of how the Nets are set up right now. Like,
yes,
if he's coming back here, it's hard to imagine him having a bigger role on a team that he could potentially have this season, simply because we know the Nets are probably just going to play very fast and loose with the minutes almost definitely from day one.
And the other thing that I'll just mention here is we'll move into Cameron Johnson. We actually do have the layout of how the figures look for Nicholas Claxton's contract as well as he returns back to Brooklyn. But other guys, this was the only player for Brooklyn that needed it, had a qualifying offer deadline here. Other players like Dennis Smith Jr., Lonnie Walker, well, I guess you wouldn't take it off the table for them to be back. We talked about this previously in the offseason. It just seems highly unlikely that there'd be any reason to go to those players right now relative to probably lower cost guys. So just kind of a roster note there around. There's nothing else really for the Brooklyn Nets to accomplish here in terms of in-house guys or decisions they were going to make. And certain players, mid-20s guys that maybe had roles here a year ago, it just isn't going to behoove Brooklyn to look at them, I think, returning here. So we'll continue to fast forward ourselves towards Cam Johnson. An interesting note when it comes to this offseason here in a second, and where his value lies and how Brooklyn may have to navigate some tricky waters getting him off the books. We'll get into that coming up here in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Look, during the summer, you love sports. Sometimes basketball can come to an end. Some of the other bigger stuff comes to an end. You're thinking, are there going to be enough sports for me over the summer? MLB, baby. FanDuel's got you hooked up with a ton of MLB stuff. Really kind of slice and dice any way you can think of it. You can just do same game parlays where you're doing, total bases, home runs, strikeouts, really kind of everything under the sun. FanDuel has just figured this stuff out. I mean, I got tons of stuff out also at WNBA, Copa America, UFC. It's all PGA Tour. It's all going down for you on FanDuel all summer long. Like I said, sometimes it can feel like the sports have stopped out over on FanDuel. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. There's always something for everyone every day, all summer long. Head on over to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
All right, so as we continue today on Locked On Nets episode, Doug mentioning it's on a Saturday here as we prepare for a week ahead. Hopefully some more news around the Brooklyn Nets and getting involved in some of these. We're already starting to get the rumblings around the league now, as you mentioned, Doug. CBA, some contract salary restrictions, like a lot of, well, what's the best value here? You can think about Atlanta and the choice they made between Murray and Young and kind of saying, well, it's not that, Murray is not just the better player, because I don't think that's the debate that people are having. It's the contract and the teams that you're moving him to and how they're looking at their aprons. And that is a new layer here before we talk Cam Johnson. That's a new layer for the NBA where you're factoring in the difference between mid-20s and mid-30s money in terms of millions of dollars. It actually is restrictive in terms of how you can build out your roster. I don't look at it as an inherently negative thing. I actually think in the long run, this is going to help teams and the league overall probably balance out and end up having some pretty good players end up on some lower level teams sooner than expected.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. It's still, I think we're still in that sort of, I do think it's always going to be the big spending is going to usually help, right? The more you spend is always going to help teams. I think that's always obvious. And, as we've always said too, sometimes it's not the talent, it's the contract, right? Like there's lots of guys who are really good, and then you just only compare it to the contract was where it starts to be a problem, right? We said you wonder why Mikal Bridges can go for six first round picks. And it's like, well, one, that his buddies are on the team helps, but two is the contract's still amazing. Like that contract allows you to kind of go and pay OG Anunoby all the money in the world, right? Like these contracts, the ones, and so when you look at DeJounte Murray and Trae Young, it's like, well, who's better? Well, Trae's better, but who's easier to make a team around. It's like, well, DeJounte, maybe you can just spend more. Like, or you can spend money.
And who's easier to maybe move again if you need to?
Right.
Who's easier to bring in now and then still pivot off of in 2 years if you needed to, right?
Right. So these guys like, Levine, Beal, these guys are like, are they bad basketball players? No, they're not bad. But are they bad relative to like 50 million a year? Like more? Yeah, that's where you just get yourself in real trouble. And so, and I honestly, to some degree, it's like, it's kind of the case with Cam Johnson, DFS, right? It's like these guys, any team would add these guys. We just are probably pressing up against the number at which they feel comfortable doing it. Like this is like, and I think this is going to be the theme sort of as we see it. And then look, there's still trades unfolding. The summer's going to have movement here. Like, the Jazz floating Lauri Markkanen. Like there's going to be more stuff that happens here. And there's some chance that Cam and DFS are off, but it's like, it just gets, and we've said this so many episodes now, but it's just worth repeating. It's like, it just gets a little tricky around the money. And that's where it always kind of, look, it's just like in regular life. That's where you just start having the conversations. Like, what's the cost? It's like not too different than any other thing you buy in your life. It's like, yeah, would you do it for free? Sure. Would you do it for X?
Love it.
Well, now we got to think about it. It's just like, it's not too different. It's not too different in this situation. So, I mean, I think they'll move, but I just don't think necessarily it's the easiest thing in the world as we see it on shift. But they are for sure guys that could get thrown in as like other, if they're 3-team deals and stuff like that. Like we could even see that kind of maybe unfold for the Nets.
Yeah, and so that's why when it comes to Cam Johnson, there's 2 factors I think here, and neither of them are prohibitively restrictive about moving him off of here. And I don't think that it's the end of the world for the Brooklyn Nets to have to say, yeah, it's going to be a little bit trickier. Maybe we end up taking a little bit less than we want, whatever it's going to look like. I don't view this as being an issue. So I think after the shift into the rebuild model, trading Mikal Bridges to the Knicks, it's easier to have everything kind of be camped in, yeah, this is okay. We can choose to make these decisions over a longer timeline, and we don't have to feel like we need something to come back. Go ahead before I get into it.
Yeah. So I want to say one more thing. I actually meant to say this before, but it's worth repeating now. The other part of keeping these guys around is that while we are, and I said it last time, I'm just going to expand on it for 1 second. Okay. While we're talking about tanking and losing and going for these, 2 things to note. One is the lottery odds have flattened. So like finishing dead last, if you lose 0 games, you have the same lottery odds as the team that lost the next closest, which could be 20 or won 20 more than you, right? So you can go 0-82 and your odds don't get a lot better by losing 20 if another team goes 20-72 or 20-62. So that's one thing. So what we often see from some of these tanking teams is everyone does try for a while, right? Like,
yes,
they try early on. They're going to like try to win games, having veterans around to do that and like have a real product that you can like sell your fans on to buy tickets. It's not the worst thing. You can always shift into lose everything in like March, right? Like there's plenty of games to lose at the end of the season. So even if these guys were on the team to start the season, it's just like not the worst thing. And it wouldn't even be the worst thing if the Nets started like 5-5 or 10-0. Like they can just like, they're not going to, by the way, but there's games to lose later when everyone's done the little sideline handshake agreement that we're not trying anymore. But you really don't see that too much in the beginning of the year. You don't see it at all, really.
No, because you're still whether or not it seems obvious, you still go with the hope springs eternal at the start of every new season, regardless of what the agenda is.
And you got to sell your guys on this too.
Sorry,
you got to sell your guys on it too. Like you can't just go tell Cam Johnson and DFS and Cam Thomas, hey, it's like, and Nick Claxton's like, lose. Like you're not going to and so you can just do the first 50 games, 60 games where you just don't really have this in mind. The Nets are going to lose plenty anyway. So that's why I just mean like having these guys around isn't the worst thing. Sorry.
No, it's fine. And also on that note too, because you go back and look at this draft that just happened right now for 2024, right? So the Atlanta Hawks end up spiking the first overall pick. They had a 3% chance of that and only a 13.9% chance of being in the top 4. Teams like, in terms of best percentage to land number 1 overall, it was Washington, who fell to 2nd. You also had Detroit, who fell all the way to 5. And then even teams like Charlotte and Portland, 13.3 and 13.2% chance to get number 1 overall. They had 50% chances to get in the top 4, and that didn't happen for them. So it ends up shaking out differently, as we all know. 4.5% chance for that Brooklyn pick that went to Houston to land at the number 1 overall. Still got top 3. So it's going to flesh out the way that it does. And it's a good point to remind everybody, this isn't about getting the absolute worst record in the NBA, especially in this deep class. It's just about being in that window, and there's time to achieve that goal. Now, on Cam Johnson, though, specifically, there's 2 things here. So one element that I think factors in trying to move him, and I saw this care of Locked On Lakers, Andy Kamenetsky was pointing out in regards to D'Angelo Russell. They're bringing him back on the opt-in. Doesn't mean that they're going to keep him necessarily, but he referenced how D'Angelo Russell was really important to the regular season as much as the postseason for the Lakers. And it reminded me that when you look at Cam Johnson, who played in 58% of his career as a starter, came as a Brooklyn Net, and he only has 124 career starts versus 283 career games. Why? Because he's been injured a lot. He's only played over 65 games in his career one time. So I think the health factor for him is a big part of teams looking at him. And maybe when you talk about what you're willing to give up, listen, you guys want to get off the contract, you want to move this veteran player, you're in tank, great. But we're taking some risk here around a guy that may only play in 40 to 50 games for us this year. And even if he does play in 65 games, it only increases the chances that maybe he won't be available for all of the playoffs. I think that's a big factor just in terms of what he represents as a 3-and-D type player, the model that he is. Yeah, it's great. But you have to calculate for the risk in him not being available for a full season.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's definitely built in with him at this point, right? Like, I don't think that's I don't think that's even under debate, right? Like, he's just not. He's not the epitome of health. It's just the way it is. And I honestly, I think that's probably the other thing. I mean, that plus the contract, it's like not just like the set it and forget it guy. I mean, one of the reasons you can sell a guy like Bridges really easily is like he plays in every game. Now, is that projectable? Yeah. Just because you played in every game doesn't mean you'll play in every game going forward. Of course not. Like, usually past experience doesn't like predicate just like future health all the time, but at least we know you'll go out there under suboptimal conditions. Like, that matters, right? Like, it's a
I'm a gamer.
It's like it's sort of the opposite of the Ben Simmons thing. Not even the injury related, just like, hey, he sat out a whole season, so okay, like he can do it. He might do it again. With Cam, it's like he's just been injured like kind of every single year, right? So and you just can't. And by the way, last year was like a bunch of soft tissue like stuff that just kind of was reoccurring. It wasn't even, it was like, his hamstrings are bad again. And they're like, oh man, okay. Like that's kind of rough. So there is some risk.
One other thing here on him as well, before we talk about a little bit of the roster shift and obviously a change in what matters here in this version of the rebuild for the Brooklyn Nets. Notable that when they signed the contract for Cam Johnson, it included a lot of unlikely incentives. There's another factor for teams bringing him in. Over the next 3 seasons, he has 3.4, 3.1, and 3.4 million in what are considered to be unlikely bonuses. Unlikely bonuses by Brooklyn Nets standards and where their trajectory was. If you put him onto, if he gets plugged into Team X contender as a starter and is expected or lucks out and plays the bulk of the season and goes into a deep playoff run, there's a world where other teams are also factoring in. That's not just that reasonable contract. It's potentially pushing us into apron territories depending on how that season unfolds for them.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think, did they outline exactly what the bonuses were? I know he didn't hit them. I think
no, he didn't do it for Brooklyn.
Part of them, I think, was games played, but sometimes these bonuses have to do with like playoff stuff and just like sort of like overall, like maybe just like really super, like very, very high end statistical stuff. But it's, if he gets plugged into a good team, like he was on the Lakers, right? I mean, the Lakers, you could really see him. You could see him really fitting in well there, right? Like the part where a shooter like him around LeBron, like that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, the other thing with LeBron too, like with the Lakers, why things could be lining up is now this was reported under like the mid-level exception piece, but he did opt out of LeBron today opted out of his player option with the intent to re-sign. And there's speculation that he's going to re-sign at a lower number so they can hit that MLE and be able to bring guy in. Now, Cam wouldn't factor in under that, but the idea where he's going to take less money so they can bring in more money, he would factor under those circumstances. So it'll be interesting to see where that ends up going. But LeBron looks like he's going to take less money just to maybe be able to field a contender around him and his boy. And by his boy, I mean his actual boy, his son. Yeah.
Yeah, between him and his boy, not Anthony Davis, his actual son who was on the team. Yeah, listen, when you're 39 years old, you all start to take these things into account. And for the maybe I heard this talked about too, for the first time in his career, say, okay, normally like you're going to pay me every buck because I'm worth every buck. This is an instance where I'm willing to kind of get a little bit flexible here. Coming up in a second, not only the final details on the Nicholas Claxton contract, but also what this rebuild is relative to the last time Brooklyn did it in that flashy D'Angelo Russell led era. We'll get into that to close out in just one moment. All right, so as we close out today's Locked On Nets episode, reminder, get us on YouTube, get us on your podcast feeds. We're doing it all summer long, 5 days a week, and we're really good at it, I would say. I'm not going to be unabashed about it. I think we do a great job. When we talk about, Doug, the Nicholas Claxton contract here, just first and foremost, they return him on a 4-year deal. It is actually escalating money, unlike, say, the Cameron Johnson one, where they tried to make it palatable down the road. 22.3 escalating up to in 27-28, $27.6 million. The only thing I'm interested about with him, generally speaking, is how quickly we might start to hear going through next season, I think potentially, is Nicholas Claxton a part of the long-term rebuild here? Or is this still viable? And where does the contract number look? And what teams are interested in him? And how does this $22 to $27 million number look very favorable for other teams? Like that's, I think, the next discussion for Nicholas Claxton's career, which is a bit of a shame because he ends up falling, as we said, when it was miscast parts in Brooklyn. Well, now going forward, he's actually one of the older guys that's going to be on this roster, 25, 26 years old, that still seems miscast in the short-term future for this team.
Well, $100 million can take the sting off that pretty quickly, I would think.
I think he finds it palatable. I think he's okay with that.
Yeah, so like I think that like that part of it makes it a little easier, a little softer landing, as we will say, in terms of like if we probably say pretty confidently the career worked out, right? When you're getting $100 million. But the part where
job done.
The part where it's as long as he's playing at a high defensive like rate 2 years from now, and with the cap going up, I think that's like 18% of the cap. Like I think that, and maybe less.
He's sitting right now at 15 and then de-escalating to under 15%, 15.8 right now of league cap, and then under 15 by the final year.
Right. So
which
that's
will only get better probably.
That's just going to be fine. That's going to be fine as a tradable contract. I really don't think he's part of the next version of the Nets is my guess at like 27. And there's just better chance that they can just probably get something else along the terms of the rebuild down the line. So the fact that the money ticks up a little bit, that's not a big deal. And by the way, over the next 2 years, when there's gonna be no money on the books, like that's not the worst thing either, too, right? So it's like,
it actually helps you in needing to get that salary floor.
Exactly, because they're gonna have to. I mean, like for next year, they got something like 70 million total on the books. Like they're just gonna have to bring in these bad contracts at some point. They're not gonna sign a big free agent, you wouldn't think, and so at some point, this money's going to have to come on. So the fact that it kind of ticks up a little bit and it's still under, 15, 16%, whatever, like you're just in fine shape with this contract. And like I said, as long as he can keep dialed in on the defensive end, as long as other teams can kind of see it, which I think they're going to, I think that it's just totally fine. And do I think he's part of that next iteration? Probably not. Maybe he's like right on the borderline. He's right on the borderline with age where you could probably still see it depending on how things shake out and depending how long it goes. Look, like this is an unknown, man. It's all good to say, hey, this is for 2 years and we'll see how it goes. You got to still have things go right. You got to hit the lottery odds right. You got to hit some of these other kind of, incidental guys right. They're going to have a lot of bites of the apple with draft picks, but sometimes these things can get prolonged. And so it's just a little hard to know.
And that's where I think the return contract on 4 years is good for Brooklyn. I mean, I think it's good overall, but to your point, well, okay, give me the 2025 deep draft class and we spike high. We get one of the top 3 picks. Fantastic. Give me 2026 and have it go pretty well or somewhere in the muddled middle ground. The bottom line is, though, with cap flexibility, you can sit there and be ready to go ahead and outright pursue a free agent on the market. You still have all these draft picks. So you can be making a choice as Claxton's entering the 3rd year of this contract and say, are we ready to maybe make a little bit of a push here? Are we, surging towards the playoffs again? Claxton's a great guy to keep around for that. Maybe they bring him back on another contract or not even for the negative, but if it doesn't quite land the way you want, great. Where are the offers as he reaches 27 and 28? You go ahead and continue to replenish that draft capital. Because I cannot state this heavily enough when it comes to this rebuild. The importance of Brooklyn now managing taking in some bad contracts and getting an extra pick here, an extra pick there, finding guys that maybe other teams can't afford to sign over the next couple of seasons and getting to deadlines and then holding an auction for their services. That's the way you sustain this beyond this at first rebuild, where you always have options and assets to work with. Like, this should be an engine that, regardless of even on-court success, should always propel the flexibility for this organization for the next decade plus. Like, that's the precipice they're on right now, as long as they execute relatively soundly. And it seems like Sean Marks has done that, at least initially, with the McHale trade.
And those guys are not going to be like really high cost guys to start, right? Like, the idea here is that like, everyone is either sort of a distressed asset or an unknown. And the Nick Claxton, the hand wringing around the Nick Claxton contract specifically before he signed it was, hey, they might need like literally every dollar, right? Like, if they're going to actually try to go for this thing and go for one of these $60-70 million guys, like, they're going to literally need every single dollar at that point. And at that point, overpaying even by a couple million on a contract like this could be a problem. That's just not the problem anymore. And so that's why we're not worried about it, because all the guys you're talking about, if they go reclamation route, which I'm almost for sure going to, and it's a little different too, because last time they had to go for all these reclamation guys, like you said, they had to because they had no picks. This time they have a ton of picks, so it is a little different. But there just are going to be guys that are just going to show up, and my joke every time is that I just love when a team releases a guy, just to watch every Net fan come out and say they like that guy. Like, all you got to do is be.
I like them coming out.
Oh, it's awesome. It's awesome. It's so funny because it's like, Brandon Boston. Like, he looked great in a Nets uniform. I'm like, if you watch more than 6 minutes of Brandon Boston basketball, I'd be shocked. But it's okay. You can like, go ahead and like them.
Embarrassed for you. I'd be sad for you.
It's like these scheduled tweets that are just so hilarious to me. It's like, literally anytime a guy from their team comes available, you have the group that swoops in and says, I could see it. I could see him in a Nets uniform.
Pick him up. Well, and that's my last high level note about this, which the bulk of the Nets fan base seems very much to understand. Unlike the last time they went through this rebuild, when they brought in D'Angelo Russell on the contract, and you had guys like Spencer Dinwiddie and Joe Harris, and it was, you spiked on players that other teams had disregarded as not being viable. Those guys don't matter right now. That is not what's important for Brooklyn. And again, it seems like the fan base understands this. It's just about getting financial flexibility going to next offseason, eating some bad contracts for extra draft capital. The player need not matter. It does. Taking on Bogdanovich's contract in the Mikal Bridges deal, nobody cared. It's totally fine. Picking up an expiring deal here or there. You do not need to identify diamonds in the rough right now if you are the Brooklyn Nets organization. The diamonds in the rough, they're not even that rough. They're like pretty close to being diamonds, and they're in the 2025 draft, and they have last names like Flag, right? Like, that's where the gold mine is for the Brooklyn Nets. That's why it is very different than the last time they had to do it. As you mentioned, have draft picks, have high control of your own draft picks. The Nets didn't pick top 10. The last time they did that was in 2010. Like, that's the version of this franchise that has tried to cycle through this, spike sometimes, trade it all away for superstars, have it not work out multiple times. Now you're back to neutral, where you get to dictate your own tempo and your own future. And I just think that everybody needs to settle into that. And I'm saying this somewhat with a bit of pace behind my voice, but I mean it in a good way. Like, this is a sigh of relief. This can be cool, calm, and collected going forward for Brooklyn.
Yeah, look, you're always value hunting. It's just how, like, they had to value hunt before. They had no choice. Like, they had to go extreme.
Right, yeah, we need the value because we need to compete. That we don't need to compete.
You always want to bring in guys and pay them less than they're worth. Like, that's always going to be the goal. That's just a goal for any NBA team, no matter where you are on the timeline. There's a difference. I think what you're saying is last time they had no other option. Like, they had no picks.
Right.
They had no cap space. They had no way to, or they had cap space, but they had no reason for anyone who was good to ever want to play there. And so it was necessary to go and find everyone's trash and make it their treasure.
Yes.
It happens this time. Great. It happens, but it's not, it's for sure not number one on the list. Before it was I think it's right. Is that like summarizing what you're saying? I think it's like that was number one on the list before. Now it's just part of like the regular standard operation.
That was number one, and there was no number 2 or 3. Now it's
It-
on the list, and there's several other more viable options.
Do it
above
this
on
way,
table.
or you have nobody. Like that's what it was before. Now it's kind of like, hey, there's optionality.
Which, as we all know, that's the way you want to operate a franchise, with only one option and a pretty narrow window to succeed.
Yeah, totally brutal. Okay, we're gonna get out of here. Much appreciated. Like I said, everyone that's sticking with us. I say sticking with us, growing. I mean, the show has seen some of the best numbers. Like, I mean, look, trading Mikal Bridges helped for sure, but just in terms of just people that still want to talk about Nets all summer long, I mean, go find anywhere else that's doing it 5 days a week. You won't. We are the only ones out there doing it. Happy to do it. Love doing it, and appreciate everyone that's been with us this whole time, and the many, 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 many new listeners that are still there. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets. Subscribe wherever, listen to podcasts. Leave a review too. That was a really help as well.
Yes, they do.
Oh, by the way, leave a review. 5 stars, or don't bother. Don't leave a review. It's not 5 stars. I should caveat that. Don't leave a bad review.
And honestly, such a low risk that it's going to be anything other than the highest of reviews. We really appreciate everybody out there. Silence, Doug, as I was trying to say, is true wisdom's best reply. And that is Euripides.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking.
Taking it back.
Talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.